Welcome back. Much of the developing world is in crippling debt, and it looks like it's going to get worse. The IMF is proposing aid as well as loans, and richer countries have been called on to help poorer nations yet again. In 2005, the 8 wealthiest countries in the world, the G8, pledged a total increase of $25 billion in annual aid to Africa. Since then, only $3 billion have been delivered. A 2008 UN report suggested the 22 richest countries donate at least 0.7% of their overall national income in aid, but most of their donations hovered around 0.45%. Now, this raises some questions. Why is so much being promised and so little being delivered? And have the existing resources been allocated efficiently? Still joined by guests in Washington, D.C., Hugh Breedenkamp, in Oxford, Paul Collier, and in Doha, Ibrahim Owais. Mr. Breedenkamp, the G8, your donors promised to halve poverty by 2010. They promised billions. Only 14% of those promises have been delivered. What went wrong there?
Well, yes, it's true that aid budgets have not grown as quickly as was promised 4 or 5 years ago, particularly around the time of the Gleneagles summit. I think, it's always a challenge to maintain the political momentum for aid, and that will obviously be particularly difficult in the current circumstances, and that's one reason why we want to put this report out and get the message out that these countries are in need of urgent support. As Professor Collier has said, these countries played no part in the crisis and will be among the most vulnerable to its effects. The IMF is ready to play its part. Our managing director is pushing our membership to double the IMF's concessional resources so that we can provide low-income countries with more support. But even with that, we could only provide around $11 billion over the next 5 years.
Okay, so tell us, how are you going to get that money? Because it seems a lot easier to bail out banks. There's no problem getting that money, but it's very difficult getting money to the poor. So how are you going to get it?
Well, we will, we can put out the facts and the analysis in the most compelling way. Our managing director will be taking the message also to the G20 meetings, culminating in the G20 summit on April 2nd. We have, who have a global membership at the IMF. We can get the message out through our executive board and through our membership.
Okay, let's talk about that G20 summit, Mr. Collier, with the Chinese on board. Do you think this will change the way business is being done?
I think the G20 meeting is going to be narrowly focused on the issue of financial transparency. So trying to get much of an aid debate into that, I think, will be very difficult. But even if the issue is financial transparency, there's a quick win that the poorest countries of the world could get. Because, of course, what the rich countries mean by financial transparency is avoid another crisis in the rich countries. But what financial transparency should mean is helping the poorest countries to recover the enormous amounts, the billions of dollars that crooks who've been governing the bottom billion have stashed away in our banks. And it's our banking secrecy which is keeping that money there, preventing it being recovered. That, to my mind, is the feasible addition to the G20 agenda on financial transparency.
Well, Mr. Owais, it certainly seems that a new economic model is needed here.
Well, in addition to aid, I just wanted actually to take the discussion into another direction. There is a call for aid, and I admire the role of the IMF in trying to raise the red flag now for the time being in order to help those poor countries. In addition to aid, there must be also a program of debt relief or debt forgiveness. That many of those countries are being riddled by debt that they cannot service. They do not export enough to be able to pay for the interest and for part of their debt, and therefore debt relief at this particular time would help those countries somewhat, but this does not mean that this would be enough. Furthermore, I would not be at all surprised if some of those countries will in fact reverse their economic reform programs and pursue a policy which is not compatible with what had been pushed for in the past, having free trade and at the same time.
Okay, let me just bring in Mr. Breedenkamp. Should the IMF not relax as far as allowing countries like Russia and China to get involved in alleviating this problem? I know that it was only when Iceland said that they would look to Russia to get money, the IMF stepped in. I know that the IMF is very unhappy that China is investing so heavily in the Congo.
No, actually, we're not unhappy with any investment that goes into Africa, provided, of course, it's transparent. We are concerned.
But the IMF have threatened to penalise Congo if they do indeed join forces with China.
No, what we've emphasised in the case of Congo is that the terms of any investment that involves borrowing or involves government guarantees should be consistent with Congo's capacity to carry any of the additional debt or to carry the guarantees. That's the issue there, and that is in general.
But hasn't that always been the problem? Is these draconian measures imposed on these countries? They cannot keep up with this foreign debt. They need to look elsewhere. And the beauty for them, of Chinese intervention is that they go into the countries, they build infrastructure, and their demands are very little.
What we try to achieve actually is the opposite of draconian. When we go in to support a country, we actually enable more financing opportunities for that country, both through the money that we ourselves provide, but also because we help the country mobilize additional support to finance its budgets and to finance its infrastructure spending. What we do emphasize, though, is that we should not be loading countries up with additional debts that they cannot sustain. This was the origins of the debt crisis in the 1980s and 1990s. Thanks to the debt relief initiative, we have gotten now most of these countries already out of those debt problems. We don't want to see them going back in, and that's why we've emphasized that donors should now be providing support on highly concessional terms, as much as possible in the form of grants. But where grants is not possible, they should be providing very low interest loans.
Mr. Collier, would you like to see more planning, more government intervention?
What I'd like to see is better government policy within Africa. Policy has improved, but it's still got a long way to go. The whole discussion on aid in a way exaggerates the importance of aid. Policy in Africa set by African governments used to be terrible. It's got better. There's a lot of room for improvement. Broadly, the IMF has been scapegoated in these matters. The sort of policies the IMF promotes actually turn out to be the sort of policies that ordinary citizens want and achieve when they get the chance to hold governments accountable through elections. Policy as defined by the IMF improves when governments are subjected to genuine elections.
And do you think that ultimately all countries need to be responsible for themselves? Why the IMF policies are so unpopular in Africa is because the IMF policies hit directly the patronage-seeking elites that too often hold power. And so the IMF is unpopular with them. And ultimately these countries need to be responsible for themselves? Of course. And so the whole attention on aid is exaggerated relative to governments taking responsibility for the fate of their citizens. Of course, there's stuff we can do to help, and we've got a responsibility to do that. That's the thesis of the bottom billion. But in the end, it's governments being accountable to their own citizens and delivering decent policies. Mr. Owais, briefly, if you will, if this money doesn't get to those who need it the most, what are your biggest concerns?
Well, the biggest concern is famine and unemployment, a human tragedy, a large-scale misery, diseases, rise in crime. So these are only part of the unpleasantness of the current situation in those countries. If the world does not help at this particular time for a problem that they were not responsible about in the first place, and therefore it is extremely important. And I repeat that I admire that that the IMF had raised a red flag in this regard to show that the tragedy of those countries, particularly the African countries.
Okay, let's leave it there. Mr. Ibrahim Owais, thank you for your thoughts, as well as Hugh Breedenkamp and Paul Collier. Thank you all very much for talking to us. And of course, thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.